Life membership is the highest honour that a member can receive from the Property Institute of New Zealand and the New Zealand Institute of Valuers. Life membership is reserved for and recognises the exceptional career of senior members who are widely respected both in the community and in the industry for their outstanding career achievements and contribution to the profession. And now, it is with great pleasure that I would ask that by a round of applause, we welcome to stage the newest life member of the New Zealand Institute of Valuers and the Property Institute of New Zealand, Phillip Curnow.
Well, when you look at that row behind me, it's not difficult to feel very humbled to be in their presence and in their ranks, I guess you could say. Now, my wife told me to be very brief, and I will be, because I'll get punished otherwise. But I would like to thank very much the Property Institute and the New Zealand Institute of Valuers for these awards. I feel very humbled by it. It's such a wonderful feeling to be part of a group like this. And I'd have to say, I don't think I've seen the professional bodies as a group together so happy. And I think that's really, really tremendous. Now, the future really is far more interesting. And I think we've seen that with the new presidents over the last 2 years of Luke Vandenbroek and Jeff Alexander for the two professional bodies that really make up probably the bulk of the membership of the organisation. And really they've contributed hugely. They're younger, they're not old farts like the rest of us, and it's really good to see. And if I looked around, when I looked around the Institute of Valuers Council yesterday, the age range was very wide. Usually it's a little narrow gap between 100 and 100 plus. But younger ones are there, and that's really encouraging. My journey sort of probably very similar to a lot of people that I examined for registration, that they wanted a job part indoors and part outdoors. And so it was really looking around at that, and my father had two suggestions. He said, why don't you either be a valuer or a surveyor? And that sort of really where the whole thing sort of started. And I looked to see where the training was for both of them, and found I could work for the valuation department if I became an urban field cadet, and I could be paid at the same time as studying, whereas if I went to university, which had to be Otago for survey school, then I would have to work for umpteen years and not earn any money. So I decided to go with the urban field cadet scheme. So that was where my first introduction to the fact that valuation even existed. And then I had a day in the Nelson office of the then valuation department. So that all sort of seemed a lot of fun. People were coming and going, and of course they dressed it up to make it sound like it was really wonderful. And sure enough, it turned out to be a mix of things. So there were times after I'd started, I thought, this is madness, why am I doing this? But I persisted, and probably out of the 4 urban field cadets that I started with, I was probably the one least likely to stay in valuation, to be honest, because I was not a happy camper for part of it. And that was because of, I guess, the type of work I was doing that I didn't see any point in whatsoever. But nevertheless, persisted with it, and finally sort of found my niche. That niche was really getting into private practice, and it was through a a colleague in Timaru that I did that, because I was that fed up with, at that stage, 9 years in the valuation department. I said, I've got to have a change. And I'd actually gone to the AA at that point, which had a travel agency, and sort of picked up some info to organise myself a trip overseas, and happened to be walking back to the office from that, and one of, I think, about only 2 private valuers that was in Timaru at the time, I saw him in the street and he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Oh, I'm going to pack my bags and go overseas." And he said, "Oh, why don't you come and work for me?" And at that point, I'd never even thought about joining the private world. And of course, I then went home and said to Lynn, "Well, actually, somebody else might actually employ me. This is a bit of a revelation." So I went and actually had a meeting with this chap, and he sort of encouraged me to sort of think about it. Once I did that, I started thinking, well, do I want to stay in Timaru or do I want to go somewhere else? So that was really my first step into it, and 2 jobs came up, one in Gisborne and one in Hamilton. So Hamilton was the one that the people said, "Well, we'll pay you to fly up from Timaru." So, it's a big trek, and I didn't have any money really. And so ended up with that job, and then got asked whether I'd come to Gisborne for the interview. And I thought, oh, that sounds like fun. Never having been to Gisborne. But Lynn says, "Don't be a fool. You've already taken a job. You can't go say you'd like to have a look at another one in the meantime." So Hamilton it was that we came to. So and that started me in the private sector, and a whole new look at valuation, to be honest. Probably in the first 6 months, I worked with a guy who'd come back from the war, and he told me all sorts of stories and his background as to how he got into valuation. He was actually a joiner. So I thought, oh, it's, everyone can have a crack at this. And he sort of really taught me probably more in 6 months about the art of valuation than I'd learned really in 9 years at the valuation department. Although, to be fair, the 9 years I'd spent there, a large number of them were incredibly formative and a lot of fun, and made a lot of friends. So it was just a different direction, and I felt it was time. So it worked well. That was really my first 9.5 years in valuation. The valuation department's probably it's changed so much since I left. But when I was working there, and I spent 3 years in Christchurch learning, and then I got shipped out to Hokitika, and there was an office of about 5 of us over there, and we used to stay away an awful lot, and I had 2.5 years there and saw really the whole of the coast from north of Karamea right down to Bruce's Bay down in South Westland. And we used to stay away up to when we did Westport's and the districts rating revaluation. We were away for about 13 weeks, I think, on the trot, and stayed in a pub called the Black and White with these other guys. Apart from 2, there was 3 of us that were single. Not that meant anything, but it just meant that we weren't too worried if we woke up in the morning and we'd been a bit beery the night before and over imbibed, because no one was really looking over our shoulder at us. We were just sent away for the week to go and do the job, and we just did. And how we filled in our time was over to us. We had to finish it, obviously, but you just did what you did for the day. You got through as much as you could so you weren't staying away too long. But once you'd done that and you came together at night, because we all went in different directions during the day, and sometimes, you know, if someone was dropping you off in a car and they were pretty tardy at picking you up, you know, you sort of cursed them and found a good place to sit. And if it was in the sun, that was fine. But if it was on the west coast, it was likely to be wet. So that wasn't that much fun. But you still ended up enjoying their company in the evening. And we used to have breakfast and dinner in the kitchen because we were part of the family. And of course, those are times you interact with these people. And one of the guys that was there, about the only one I think still alive, he's still a great mate of mine, and he rings me up from time to time and reminds me what my roots were, so that after I got the life membership, he rang up and just reminded me to be a little bit grounded. And of course, everything I said to him, everything I've learned from him when we were together down on the west coast. So that sort of staying away was great, and also you had a lot of fun because you would also be staying away when people came in, especially farmers. They came in and they wanted to object to their valuations, but really it was an excuse to come in and have a yarn. And we used to meet in council chambers, and they would just come in and just talk. And in the end, you'd often sort of wonder, what did they want to do about their valuation? Well, nothing really. You know, it sounds like you guys know what you're doing. It's fine. I just really wanted to come in and just have a chat and have a find out of what was being done and how it was all done. And they wander off again. So those sorts of things you took a lot of pleasure with, because someone sort of could see the point of what you were doing. That was just fun. When I got married, my wife, Lynn, said, well, when I came back from staying away, I was more over in Timaru at that point. You're just disrupting the household by coming back. She says, I got to change my routine. But then people thought nothing of that in the valuation department, staying away weeks on end. Other people who have been mentors have sort of done it probably without them knowing the influence that they've had, and that's been a key thing, because one of the things that I suppose valuers, certainly my age, we're not huge collegial team players. That's more the younger people that come along, and they've got perhaps a different way of doing things. So we're older ones probably a little bit more loners as far as doing valuations concerned, but you do build up a network of people that you can talk to, and you hear what they're doing, and you just sort of soak it up from them. And there's been a number of people over the years that I've come to have huge respect and admiration for, and then even more so when I've been working with them either on the registration board or doing arbitrations, and you sort of their influence really spins off, because you know that there are people out there that are so clued up, and you sort of think, well, that's people I want to learn from. Heaps of them. And they've, a lot of them have remained lifetime friends as well, or certainly for the last 20 odd years. Well, to be fair, every job is a challenge, and it's like every client who rings up and asks me to value their factory or whatever, there's always something riding on it for them, and so you've got to do the best you can for that. So what might seem a simple job is when you start getting careless. And that's one of the things I've learned, that you can't sort of say, well, that's a simple job, I can knock that out just in a few hours and be done with it. And it just doesn't work that way, because the older I've got, the more I know, the less I realise I know, and you're always sort of searching for a little bit more information. And so there's always a challenge for every job to get the most useful, relevant information, and that's been probably the thing that's kept me focused in more recent years. And our standards have had a role in that to a certain extent. Because when I started in private practice, you wrote a report. It was very, very brief. There was no information in it apart from what the property looked like. And that was about it. Whereas now we actually have to reveal primarily our inner thoughts about how we arrived at the valuation. And we'd never used to do that. If we were doing a rental, for argument's sake, you could end up thinking, well, the rental's probably about $50 a square metre for this workshop. And 9 times out of 10, that was never challenged. And it was only when it's challenged, you thought, oh, gee, I better go and find information. Whereas now, I've got a huge database, and you pull out information and you think, gee, we've got something better than this. You might have, dozens of rentals. And once you start looking at them, you think, well, what's most relevant? And so the more I learn, the more I think, gee, I've got to get more and more info and useful info. And then you cull it down to a very small number that go on the report that are the most relevant. And that's a challenge no matter what the job is. So I never take them for granted. It seems more complex, and to a large part, our profession has made it that way. And I think they've got a tiger by their tail with it, to be fair. It's probably something we could talk about later, but that's meant you can access so much more, but I don't seem to get the reports completed any quicker, because there's information there. You just got to search for it, and you might have different ways of searching for it. Whereas the first start off in private practice, the sales came in once a month on a sheet of paper. So you never really had, especially for anything other than housing, that useful information, unless you went out and developed contacts in the real estate world, who you could ring up and say, well, what happened to that property? And that was sort of quite a thing. Having those sort of networks was really more important than having any technology. And the technology took a long time to get beyond the paper, and then it was really only after Jeff and I set up in '87, or probably slightly before then, microfiche came along. And we still only got those, I think, once a fortnight. And they were hideous things to work with. Those who have grown up in the digital era don't know what they're missing. I've still got one as a museum piece that I've kept in the office. So that was how our plans were. We got them on microfiche, and you only got them every probably year. So subdivisions would happen, and you were looking for things that didn't exist, or if you didn't have base data, you couldn't find out even where the jolly property was. So it was. It's a wonder we didn't value more properties, that we got the wrong property, to be fair. I have heard that happen. Not by me. More information, more technology doesn't actually make you quicker. It means that you don't have an excuse, so you actually got to do, I think, more homework. I found that very satisfying, because that really came out of frustration. There was several of us, and Tony Kulev was one of the other pivotal people involved in this. And I remember after we'd signed off the documents in 2016, he said, "Do you realise it's 10 years that it's taken us to get to here?" And I said, "Yes, it's been a long labour, to be honest." And it really fell out because we were, I guess, very unhappy about the direction of the profession in terms of getting research done and having publications and those sorts of things. And we've still got a long way to go, but it's a start, and I've been greatly heartened by how the profession and the PINZ HQ, I guess you could say, have assisted in this. And I'd have to say that the then chief executive was not happy with me putting this through at an AGM. But once it had gone through, then the professional body fell in behind and said, "How can we help?" So that was great. And I've been delighted about that. And that's because, we're all in for the same reasons of trying to lift the profession up and get better learning, and that's ramped up considerably. And I think the current head office with you and Viv and Rebecca and others, that's ramped up and become far more focused and effective, and that's been great to see. And so, it means that the foundation can do other things rather than some of the things that we had thought it might needed to get involved in beforehand. So the base of education is spreading, and I think that's tremendous. Well, the supporting trustees actually make that work, and they've all got a task to do, and they basically carry me. And in a quiet moment, Tony Kulev will tell you that's more ways than one. So he's been huge in this process, and to me, it wouldn't have existed without him, and that's just a plain fact. And he knows how to set the detail up and make it work, and that's incredibly important. And so it's been a fun run, and we've had two younger folk come on as co-opted trustees just in the last month, and that's tremendous. So that it's getting people who are really younger than Tony and myself involved, and soon as we can hand over the reins to them, the better, to be fair, and that's how it should be. Having a business partner that was prepared to put up with me doing these things, which were just really a drain in money rather than recovery of money. So that made a big difference. And really, without Jeff supporting what I've done with the Institute, I wouldn't have had the time to do it. And he's sort of basically let us do my thing, and that's very, very helpful. So the arbitration world was great, because everything I do in the arbitration world is focused around valuation, and it's really an extra learning. I learned so much in the training that I realised how hopeless I was at it beforehand, and I just wish more valuers would get involved. And I suppose that's where I've come across a lot of very expert people involved in disputes in the valuation world, and that's been tremendous. And to be fair, that's an area that a lot of people in their various firms, like Seegers, Telfer Young, Colliers, they've got a lot of senior people who are incredibly good at being expert witnesses. And I just love to see more of their trainees coming along to see what valuation's like at a different stage in their career and a different focus, because they get a masterclass in how to be an expert witness, which would serve them incredibly well in whatever forum they get involved in. So I just like to see people getting more involved in that, and just, you know, those firms have some superb people who give evidence, and dealing with QCs under questioning. It's an art. It really is an art, and it's not something you learn without doing. And everyone who has been an expert witness or know, and I've certainly been there, that when you're being grilled by a QC who wants you to say things that you don't really want to say or you're not sure about, it's an incredibly uncomfortable position to be in, but you do learn an awful lot. But the legal profession themselves are, I think, quite entertaining, because with arbitration, I've managed to work with a number of retired judges and what have you, and the way that their colleagues act when they're sitting on the bench with us is quite delightful. They're very deferential, whereas our senior practitioners are not deferential to the adjudicators like the legal people. I think it's hilarious. Well, I think probably the things that I'd like to see happen is the profession shake what I call the shackles of the banks off them. I think we have let ourselves become too not so much constrained, but too directed by a particular client area. And I know the reasons why, and I've often had discussions with the past presidents about how we got in this position, and I know exactly why, but I think we have to be more equipped to stand up to the banks. We are a profession which has probably a way of dealing with our members who don't fit or don't match the required standards and reporting and ethics and what have you, and that costs those people a lot of money to be disciplined. Whereas the banks don't see that side of it, and they just sort of say, well, we'll only take reports from certain people because the rest of the valuers are all a bunch of crooks. And that, to me, is just so wrong, and it's denigrating the people who go through a huge learning curve for the profession. You know, they're doing a minimum of 3 years, whereas you know, the conjoints are 4 years and the Lincoln degrees 4 years, and then they've got a minimum of 3 years to get their registration. So a lot of cases it's 7+ years before they get their registration. And I think to treat them as the way they do, with saying that you must do this, that, and the next thing, and effectively direct their standards and direct their ethics of it, to me is not a good way to grow in the future. And I've read what has happened overseas when that has really taken great hold, and it's not good for the profession, because the profession's key thing is its independence. And if we're effectively become a lapdog of the lending profession, then we're not doing ourselves any favour. And that's why when you're doing jobs beyond just straight bank lending, you don't have that same issue. The people that you're dealing with, and again, to come back to the legal profession, they have far greater, they rate valuers far higher than valuers rate themselves. And their expectations of valuers are far higher than valuers have of themselves. And, they're expecting a professional to be a professional, whereas we're too busy racing around to say, well, whether we've got 5 sales within 6 months for the banks, who have no idea what that valuer has had to go through to find 6 sales or 5 sales, and the valuer will say, well, none of them are any jolly good anyway, or they might have one that's any good, but they need 5, so we give them 5. And so that's, if someone who's done 7 years of training, to be sort of directed in that manner, to me is not a way to grow a profession in the slightest. So that's what I'd like. Key thing I'd like to see is the profession effectively stand taller, and certainly stand taller in support of their members, because their members, by and large, have put themselves through constant ongoing professional development. They've done, with Jeff Alexander and the council just previously, brought it down from 4 years to 2 years, and the whole thing is just ramped up. So we're coming from a base where our professionals are being upskilled as professionals, and I think that we need to be able to demonstrate that better to a certain section of our client base. It's not all of it, because it's those that are involved in other activities than lending are certainly not bound up in that part of it. If I didn't have to do lending valuations, I wouldn't be unhappy in the slightest. The key thing, that the profession to stand much taller than they were. And my colleague Jeff Tizar always goes back to what valuers earned and how they were seen when we first came into the private world as equals. And then we've, through various decisions and various ways we've acted, have let that slip. It's a different profession from when I started, but the people in it are now far more educated than we ever were. Hugely more educated, and way more diverse in terms of not so much ethnicity, but in outlook. It was a incredibly male-orientated profession, but there were 2 women who were valuers that I worked with in Timaru, and that's back in the late 1970s. But they've now, the women are now a far greater part of the profession than they were, and so that's a magic step forward, so that we actually represent the community a bit more. And the range of, I'm not one for ethnicities. I'm more on a who's qualified for the job type of thing to think about. But to me, it's the more people who get involved, who have different interests, and their different character flows off on the profession. And like I said, my first boss in private practice, he started life before he went off to the war as a joiner, a cabinet maker. So and now we've got people that come out with double degrees, and we haven't have anyone in the practicing world with a PhD that I can recall more recently, but there's certainly a lot that have done a lot of higher education and done, oh gosh, they've done sort of a lot of extra educational work. So that's great to see. It's got to broaden its base, because there are less valuers practicing now than when I started. I mean, so that's the madness of the system. That there's still, you say a round number of 1,000 of us with annual practicing certificates. But 20 odd years ago, when the FPINZ and FNZIV were getting together, I think FNZIV had something like 2,500 members at that stage. So, in terms of numbers, we're not gone anywhere. And I was listening to something on it was an article that I read where there was, I think, 30,000 lawyers. So there's 30 lawyers to every one valuer. And, we act in a part of the profession or part of the world or part of the economy, I guess you could say, that has huge importance. And there's 1,000 of us.